former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Civilization versus mob rule. That's how President Trump has now framed the 2020 election. Will his strategy work? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com, and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. As President Trump deals with the withering challenges of a stubborn virus that's now infected some 3 million Americans and a de facto communist uprising in the streets, aided, abetted, and validated by Trump-deranged elite media, the president fights back. But he's down in the polls. Will he embrace the role of underdog one more time as he did in 2016? Plus, what to make of that story about Russians offering or paying a bounty to kill U.S. soldiers? We'll talk over the much-debated story with LibertyNation.com defense and foreign policy expert Dave Patterson. Plus, we'll detail a most consequential week at the Supreme Court when we're joined by LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza for Talkin' Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. President Trump has now laid down his marker and established his beachhead for the presidential election now less than 4 months away. He traveled to Mount Rushmore and established the defining issue of his campaign, a ringing defense of Western civilization.
I am here as your president to proclaim before the country and before the world, this monument will never be desecrated. These heroes will never be defaced. Their legacy will never, ever be destroyed. Their achievements will never be forgotten. And Mount Rushmore will stand forever as an eternal tribute to our forefathers and to our freedom.
And then the president spared no harsh words in condemning the Black Lives Matter Marxist assault on American culture.
There is a growing danger that threatens every blessing our ancestors fought so hard for, struggled, they bled to secure. Our nation is witnessing a merciless campaign to wipe out our history, defame our heroes, erase our values, and indoctrinate our children. Angry mobs are trying to tear down statues of our founders, deface our most sacred memorials, and unleash a wave of violent crime in our cities. They think the American people are weak and soft and submissive. But no, the American people are strong and proud, and they will not allow our country and all of its values, history, and culture to be taken from them.
Of course, the left-wing media absolutely despised that speech. And as the always reliable and incisive Molly Hemingway said on the Federalist podcast, the media has now taken its bias to another level.
I think people are kind of used to seeing the media behave poorly when they are supposed to be reporting on events. This was the first time I saw sort of an all hands on deck, we have to lie about what happened. This is something altogether different. It's like the guardrails are completely off. However they had been used before to keep people from just completely going off the side of the road, that's just gone. And if it's like you need to lie about it, that's fine. If you need to deny what was in your own newspaper the day before, that's fine. Whatever it takes to defeat the bad orange man apparently will be supported, tolerated, and encouraged by many major media figures.
And so the president deals with sworn enemies not just in politics, but in the press and academia, who were willing to say or do anything to bring him down. And many of them are now even all but admitting it with their behavior, if not their words. This, as Trump deals with the simultaneous sword of Damocles, a virulent virus that won't go away, some 3 million cases of COVID. We'll talk later about whether Trump can embrace his role as the rare president entering the home stretch of a presidential race as an underdog and overcome his current bulging deficit in public polls. But let's hammer the point home again for those still confusing Black Lives Matter with a racial justice movement. Black Lives Matter has not even tried to hide its Marxist ideology. One of the co-founders recently admitted it openly. And yet, their transparently totalitarian ideology has slipped the notice of almost all elite media. But not everyone is willing to cower in fear. Longtime ESPN sports journalist and black man Jason Whitlock went on Fox News to decry the NFL's reported decision to fully bow before Black Lives Matter.
If the NFL starts out its season with everyone standing for Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem, and then virtually everyone on the field taking a knee when the Star Spangled Banner plays, the NFL will run off a nice fat chunk of its audience and will never be seen the same again. There's no way you can do any homework on Black Lives Matters and not see that it's a Marxist political organization. It's not about black death. It's not about black men. It is a political move. It's a communist political move. This is a historic failure of men and leadership. This is cowardice at its highest level.
And the NFL is not the only sports league prostrating themselves before Black Lives Matter in full compliance with their demands. The NBA will plaster the Black Lives Matter logo on all their playing surfaces. And NBA player Marcellus Wiley says nobody is willing to pay attention to their toxic cultural goals.
I don't know how many people really look into the mission statement of Black Lives Matter, but I did. Being a father and a husband, that's my mission in life right now. How do I reconcile that with this mission statement that says, quote, we dismantle the patriarchal practice. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement. Children from single-parent homes versus two-parent homes. The children from the single-parent homes, this is in 1995, 5 times more likely to commit suicide, 6 times more likely to be in poverty, 9 times more likely to drop out of high school, 10 times more likely to abuse chemical substances, 14 times more likely to commit rape, 20 times more likely to end up in prison, and 32 times more likely to run away from home.
Yes, there are still some people, like Marcellus Wiley, projecting honesty and courage, willing to speak out about the growing acceptance of a patently un-American ideology. You see, politics has always been downstream from culture. The Marxists, communists have always followed the axiom that if you win the culture, the politics will follow. That's how they took over Russia and China. Foment culture wars, stoke violence in the streets, and ultimately take over a weakened and retreating state. But as if Trump didn't have enough to worry about, how about this one? The Trump-Kanye alliance is over.
Kanye West's July 4th announcement that he's running for president took the world by storm. But the rapper isn't quite done dropping some shocking truths. The Yeezus singer spoke with Forbes to clarify whether or not he's serious about running for president. Spoiler alert, yes, he is.
After courting controversy for his support of U.S. President Donald Trump, Kanye officially tells Forbes magazine, "I'm taking the red hat off."
Now, you might ordinarily dismiss a celebrity candidate like that, but both Trump and Biden should be concerned because Biden is counting on a huge black turnout for him, and Trump has worked tirelessly to win more of that black vote. Kanye West, if he actually stays in the race, complicates things for both sides. But as we understandably focus on getting people well and back to work and try to wrestle with the chaos in the streets, the world goes on. And so does China with its campaign to put the boot on Hong Kong. And as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced this week, that campaign is now complete.
The Chinese Communist Party implemented its draconian national security law on Hong Kong in violation of commitments that it made to the Hong Kong people and to the United Kingdom, in a UN-registered treaty and in contravention of Hong Kongers' human rights and fundamental freedoms. Free Hong Kong was one of the world's most stable, prosperous, and dynamic cities. Now it will be just another communist-run city where its people will be subject to the party elite's whims. It's sad.
Sad is an understatement. But this revived march of tyranny in our country and around the world brings right to mind the words and warning of one Ronald Reagan when he said, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free." Did the Russians offer or pay a bounty to kill U.S. soldiers? Did Trump know about it? The New York Times says yes. Trump says no. There's a surprise. We'll try and sort it out when we return.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The Russian bounty thing. It all started when the New York Times ran an article recently that alleged Russian intelligence operatives in Afghanistan had offered the Taliban a bounty for killing U.S. and U.S.-led coalition soldiers. The narrative goes on to assert that both President Trump and Vice President Pence were briefed on these Russian-sponsored activities and kept it to themselves. But both the president and vice president deny having ever been briefed. Those from the intelligence community who would have done the briefing also said they did not brief either the president or vice president. So who's telling the truth through this haze of confusion? Is this the huge scandal implied by the screaming headlines in the New York Times, or just another fake scandal ginned up by a media smelling yet more blood in the water surrounding President Trump? Here to help us figure that out is the maven of all things defense and foreign policy at LibertyNation.com, J. David Patterson. Dave, welcome back.
Thank you, Tim. Glad to be with you.
It's a pleasure as always. So, Dave, this seems to be something of a moving target, this Russian bounty story. First, what do we know for sure? What can we verify about the existence of a bounty on U.S. soldiers by Russia, meaning Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think we don't know as much as we'd like. We know that last week, U.S. intelligence chief Gina Haspel from the CIA and John Ratcliffe, Director of National Intelligence, briefed congressional leadership in a classified briefing. And but the question is always, well, what did Vladimir Putin know and when did he know it? And I suspect that he didn't know much about this at all.
Why do you say that?
We get the idea that Russia is this centralized activity where you have this one fellow, Putin, who directs all the activities that go on. And that's about as true in Russia as it is in the United States.
So you're saying that this could have gone on unbeknownst to Vladimir Putin, even though the media depicts him as a all-powerful dictator who knows everything that goes on in his country. But let's go on to what we know for sure or don't know about whether the president and or vice president were briefed, and if they were, how they responded.
Well, I think the White House has steadfastly maintained that the president and vice president did not receive verbal briefings on this subject. And we do have a little more information now because the press spokesperson came out and said that the 30-year veteran at the CIA who would have briefed them on this subject chose not to. And I suspect for very good reasons, because the intelligence was not fully formed and perhaps what they had wasn't credible.
Now, Dave, in reading your story and others about this subject, this seems to me to have all the earmarks of a sort of a classic Russian disinformation campaign designed to shake up U.S. politics. Am I on the right track here, or is this more a product of the fertile imagination of power players on the left looking to take down Trump?
Actually, Tim, I suspect it's a little bit of both. You know, clearly this is an opportunity for the Russians to stir up chaos and discontent in the U.S., which is what they are about. But with liberals in Congress, you know, that's a low bar. They have a great willingness to believe and go berserk over anything that looks like the Trump administration can be put in a bad light.
Did this leftist obsession with Russia, which reached full flower, so to speak, in the Mueller investigation, which, lest we forget, revealed no collusion between Trump and Russia, in fact, that there wasn't any collusion for Trump to participate in, did all of that does all of this result simply from the fact that the Democrats had to blame anyone other than themselves for getting beaten by Trump 4 years ago? Or is there truly legitimate reason to fear the Russians?
I think the answer is yes and yes. Yes, this is this Democrats will use any excuse to play the Russia card. And on Russia, they are simply irrational. And what they are missing, in fact, is the real danger that both Russia and China represent.
Dave, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim. Always glad to be with you.
Dave Patterson, master of all things defense and foreign policy at LibertyNation.com.
Ready, set, go.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com, because we put the power of the press in your hands. With one click, Liberty Nation delivers tomorrow's news.
And remember, liberty.
Today.
All the time and everywhere.
Liberty Nation connected the dots between a Chinese research biolab and a wet market where COVID-19 was supposedly discovered 2 months before the MS outage. We were first to alert you of a serious attack on gun rights in Virginia. LN honed in on the Biden-Burisma scandal months before it hit the papers. We brought you exclusive interviews from the border.
We're looking at people just rising up.
Liberty Nation was on the ground in London.
Trump rally in front of the American embassy.
Bringing you on-the-scene reports about Brexit. LN reported that COVID-19 was more virulent but less deadly weeks before others. LibertyNation.com delivers tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Liberty Nation Radio, the Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles and a new Roku channel. Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
You knew the night he was elected that the presidency of Donald J. Trump would be like none we've ever seen or read about in the history books. 3.5 years later, Trump's fundamental promise to challenge the legitimacy of an encrusted, unresponsive, and unaccountable three-headed monster, the political, media, and academic establishment, has led, of course, to an unbroken string of strikingly controversial utterances and game-changing policies. And now, as if to bring his unique presidency full circle, Trump is faced with another singular challenge which threatens everything he's accomplished. He's the first president in almost a century to enter the heart of his re-election campaign as the underdog. The polls claim an almost double-digit deficit for the president, and gamblers have established his opponent, Joe Biden, as the clear favorite, with the election now less than 4 months away. Make no mistake, if the presidential election had been conducted any time from early February to early March, or perhaps before that, there's little doubt Trump would have been victorious. Peace and prosperity had him on a glide path to a second term. Democrats had employed every weapon at their disposal to take him down and repeatedly failed, disgracing themselves with fantastical accusations and with a series of presidential debates displaying their increasingly radical bent. Remember the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, taxpayer-funded health care for illegals, reproductive justice for transgenders, and all the rest of it? The question now is whether the voters will remember, because the double-barreled assault of disease and open revolution in the streets has thrown this election into a shockingly different context. The vibrant economy and game-changing foreign policy produced on the watch of the 45th president have now been overwhelmed by the urgent need to mitigate a ridiculously infectious bat virus while controlling a metastasizing mob out to overturn our very way of life. And there's only so much Trump can do when Democrats are in control of every city under siege and are openly refusing to restore the rule of law under the assumption that, unlike the unbroken string of failed attempts to remove Trump with blunt force and transparent lies, the chaos will finally sink him. There's no understating the challenge before President Trump. He's staring directly down the barrel of a loaded weapon. But some perspective is also necessary. Twin challenges of this magnitude would be no less daunting for any president. Not one of the events triggering this seeming turn in the election calculus, COVID-19, the George Floyd killing, and the violent aftermath, can be laid at the feet of this president. None of it. But it's all happening on his watch. Thus, it is ultimately his responsibility to respond under circumstances which would sink almost any person, not to mention president, into a dark night of the soul. After not even expecting to win the 2016 election by most accounts, Trump spent every waking hour in the White House trying to repair and revitalize the American economy and had the numbers to prove his success. His rising tide lifted the boats of every class and race. He vanquished the ISIS caliphate, called out NATO and China and Iran and the illegal immigration industry, and the list goes on. But now, all he gets for his efforts is this lousy question. Sure, you can build an economy, shake up the disgraced status quo, and keep us out of wars, but can you beat a virulent virus and tamp down a rebellion? Think of the things that have slipped completely out of Trump's control. He can't stop the virus. He can't keep the country locked down. He can't stop Democrats from allowing the left-wing mayhem to continue. The media is smelling blood in the water as never before. Academia is strutting in delight that America's in the throes of their long-desired cultural revolution. And now corporate America is surrendering to the public coercion of an openly Marxist political organization masquerading as a racial justice movement. Plus, the many problems surrounding the president's weak, aging opponent, Joe Biden, seem to have been subsumed by the twin crises. Even George Washington would have trouble securing a second term under these circumstances. And to give you an idea of how rare it is for a sitting president to be the underdog in his race for re-election, only once in the last century has a popularly elected president been predicted to lose his race for a second term. That was in 1932 when the nation had fallen into the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover seemed a certain loser and was indeed trounced by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Only two sitting presidents have since failed to secure a second term. Jimmy Carter in 1980 and George H.W. Bush in 1992, but neither was considered an underdog. The ultimate winners of those elections, Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, came from behind and scored resounding upset victories. On the other hand, and there's always another hand, we might think back to 1988 when a triumphant Michael Dukakis left the Democratic Convention in August with a 17-point lead over then Vice President George H.W. Bush, only to lose by 8 points. That's a 25-point turnaround in 2 months. Political fortunes have been known to change in the twinkling of an eye. The many advantages of incumbency are real, and this president left with little choice but to fight like hell, as he always has, made it clear in what could become the defining speech of his campaign at Mount Rushmore, we played it for you earlier, that he will stake his claim for a second term on a ringing defense of Western civilization, indeed civilization itself. The voters of this country are exhausted, scared, and confused enough to conflate, for now, radical Marxists with legitimate warriors for racial justice. The hard left is capitalizing mightily on this rarefied air of public acceptance they have not previously enjoyed. Whether this embrace is fleeting or represents a seismic shift in the nation's political environment becomes the proverbial $64,000 question. Will Trump savor the role of underdog as he did in 2016? Or will he be done in by the simultaneous withering assault of a cultural revolution, an intractable pandemic, and perhaps his own personality? Is the so-called silent majority of decent, God-fearing Americans still a majority? And will they remain silent? We may have no idea, probably won't, until September or October or even Election Day itself, if the country will turn its apparent acceptance of the radical assault on our culture by Black Lives Matter into ultimate rejection and extend the Trump era through 2024. The life and times of Donald J. Trump reads like a novel. People will be discussing and debating for decades his meteoric rise to fame, how he was brought low by recession, only to rise again and reach the heights of influence and power. And I'll tell you one thing, with this fighter who refuses to cower in the White House, love him or hate him, everyone on all sides knows that the last chapter of his gripping tale has yet to be written. And we'll return to discuss a consequential week at the Supreme Court on Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now, as America undergoes a collectivist revolution in the streets, let's spend some time talking about individual liberty as we welcome back in our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, and the man we turn to as our guardian of individual liberty in these times of trial, Scott David Cosenza.
Wow.
Hello, Scott.
Hi, Tim.
Yes, our nation turns its lonely eyes to you and your like, Scott, because what's going on in the streets is scary, but we're going to focus exclusively on several important cases that came before the Supreme Court and were decided this week. Let's start with 2 cases regarding the taxes of Donald Trump.
Going into July, Tim, for the first time in almost 30 years with their decision-making due to coronavirus and perhaps a bit of a delay due to the impeachment trial of Donald Trump and perhaps the recently discovered injury by the Chief Justice who fell and hit his head. So that's where we are, and the decisions went against Trump. If you look through the lens of, did he get what he was asking for? And the answer to that is no. He was asking for a ruling that said the President of the United States has immunity from congressional subpoena.
Absolute immunity.
Absolute immunity
Right.
from congressional subpoena in the one case, and absolute immunity from a criminal subpoena at a state level in another case from New York State. The court said no, and in fact, they were unanimous on that point, that no absolute immunity did exist. Then the splits came and the opinions came. And basically what the court said in both instances was, while no absolute immunity exists, that doesn't mean that the shooting match is over here. There are many ways, and they don't use these colloquialisms, but there were many ways that Donald Trump could get out of having to disclose these returns. And we have to send both these cases back to their respective lower courts for a hearing, which say, and that hearing will be guided, Tim, by the cases and the decisions that came down today. So those lower court judges will read the decisions and try to apply them now to the application.
Seems to me there's no chance that this is settled and that Nancy Pelosi or Cyrus Vance, the Manhattan District Attorney, are going to get any kind of tax forms or tax releases out of Trump before the election, which is the only thing that matters, right? Do you expect any tax returns of Donald Trump to be in the hands of Vance or Pelosi before November 3rd?
Tim, I wrote for LibertyNation.com that there's plenty of room there for multiple future trips up and down the appellate chain to resolve the issues that have been presented with these two decisions. So my quick answer is no, not by November. I expect to see many rulings and appeals from those rulings before this is all said and done.
In the end, this is nothing more than a fishing expedition trying to get dirt on Trump. So I don't know that there's any long-term significance to either of these decisions, since they won't come before November 3rd, and after that they'll no longer be relevant to the left unless they want to start another impeachment trial over his taxes.
There's kind of in the air an idea that this could reveal some nefariousness on Trump's behalf, but one thing that we've talked about, I think, before, certainly I've written about, is that Trump has filled out an exhaustive financial disclosure statement, as all presidential candidates do, which has to list every single partnership, corporation, you name it, that he has a financial interest in. The tax return doesn't show any of that. All it shows is declared taxable events, income or other things, right?
It's a witch hunt, no more, no less. And on top of that, Scott, you'd think that the left would have learned by now, after the Access Hollywood tape, the October surprise in 2016, that this kind of stuff doesn't damage Trump, because nobody elected him because of his personality or his past financial practices.
I'm surprised Lois Lerner hasn't stuck one in the mail to the New York Times by now.
Well, I'll tell you what, if he is reelected, which is very uncertain at this point, they'll go after it again, probably. Might start an impeachment trial.
That's an interesting thing that you just said, might start an impeachment trial, because one of the arguments from the justices was that, I think it was Justice Thomas, Tim, who said, if you want the president to go ahead and have to conform to your subpoena, then that's what you should do. You should impeach him. That's the mechanism by which the Constitution has provided for the Congress to challenge the authority of the president. I think that's a powerful argument to me, as somebody who thinks that we should, whenever possible, go by the written word of the Constitution. And the Constitution is the rule book for how these branches are supposed to relate to one another.
Yeah, well, they've been there and done that with impeachment. Doesn't mean they can't do it again. A president could be subject to impeachment an unlimited number of times in theory and in a second term. Well, Bill Clinton was impeached in a second term, and Richard Nixon resigned during a second term. The only way I could see that happening is if Trump manages to win, but the Democrats take the House and the Senate, in which case they can control the impeachment and the Senate trial.
If a schizophrenic nation sends Donald Trump to the White House and Democrats to control the Congress.
Yes. Well, look, this is a country that elected Obama twice and then Trump. Let's go back to the court. And there's a decision that didn't get as much publicity, but you think is very important, Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Tim, this case involves what's called the ministerial exception to employment law. You can imagine that if a church wants to dismiss a minister, the court can't get into whether or not he or she was appropriately faithful to the word, because that's something for the faithful to determine and not the court. And so this exception covers sort of religious employees, if you will. And this case concerned whether or not these teachers, who were Catholic school teachers, both of whom claim they were dismissed inappropriately, one for a disability and another for age, whether they would be covered. That when they sued, the diocese said, well, we don't even have to defend this claim. They didn't admit it. They didn't say that's why we fired these people. They just said we don't have to bother trying to get to that point because they are covered under this ministerial exception. So the reason why I think this is a huge case is because if you can't control who is in charge of a religious instruction at an academy, well, then you can't have a religious academy anymore. If the courts get involved in that sort of thing, Tim, the more they have their nose under that tent. And it was a 7-2 decision. So justices, so it was the typical, you might expect from the conservative side. I believe Gorsuch wrote the opinion. And if I'm wrong about that, he definitely was in the majority with Justice Roberts, Justice Alito.
And two progressives.
Kavanaugh. Well, yes. And Kavanaugh and Kagan and Breyer. Ginsburg and Sotomayor at the far left wing of the court, I thought just gave a straight, real education in what it means to legislate from the bench. Because they started off talking about basically, you know, when you started an opinion, you talk about like the horrible result for the party. We already know that's an appeal to heartstrings, and it's not really how the Supreme Court is supposed to operate. They're setting a national policy, exactly. and so that's how they started their opinion. I thought why it was a naked kind of appeal to emotion, and that's not what we have from the other side of the court. And
it seems to me that this is as seemingly obvious a decision as absolute immunity for the executive branches. Okay, Scott, we got time for one more case, and this is an important one for the average American who gets bombarded, as I do, and I bet you do, with robocalls constantly.
Congress passed a law prohibiting robocalls to cell phones. Then they passed an exception to that law that said if you were collecting money for the government, you could robocall cell phones. But it wasn't just actual government debt collectors. It was anybody like servicing a student loan that's backed by the federal government or mortgages or whatever. It's millions of accounts and millions of people with those accounts. It's not a small thing. And a political consultancy wanted to use robocalls to spread their political message. And they sued and they said, well, if the government gets to make dunning calls with robocalls, that's our First Amendment right should trump our political speech right should trump that. And the Supreme Court said, you're right. It is a violation of your First Amendment rights that the government can do that, but you can't. But what they didn't do was grant those political consultants the remedy they wanted, which was the ability to make those robocalls. What they said was, instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to cross off that exception to the law that Obama signed a few years ago, and we're going to go back to the point where nobody can make these calls. That'll cure the First Amendment breach, and nobody will get calls.
Oh, Scott, I can't tell you how refreshing it is to end this show of doom and gloom with some good news for the average American.
Well, it's a First Amendment restriction, though, but with a positive with a positive side benefit.
Scott, at this point, almost any kind of halfway good news will suffice. Thank you.
Tim, they've been trying to reach you about your car warranty on the other line.
I appreciate it. Scott Cosenza, ladies and gentlemen. This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue, with our own Mark Angelides, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we will be back at you next week. In the meantime, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty, and we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.